It was a warm summer evening when Rachel first noticed him. The new neighbor had moved in only a few days earlier, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. She had seen him a few times through the kitchen window, a shadowed figure working in the yard, but tonight was different. He was closer now, just on the other side of the low garden wall that separated their properties. She watched as he worked, his shirt sticking to his skin from the heat, his muscles flexing under the strain of moving the heavy bags of mulch. "His name is Daniel, I think her husband, Mark," said suddenly from the doorway, startling her. Rachel blinked and turned to face him, trying to hide her embarrassment at having been caught staring. "Oh." Mark chuckled, crossing the room to stand beside her at the window. "Yeah, I ran into him earlier. He seems nice. A bit reserved, but who wouldn't be after moving to a new town?" Rachel nodded, watching as Mark's gaze shifted to Daniel. "You should go over and introduce yourself," Mark suggested, his voice casual. "Me?" Rachel asked, surprised by the suggestion. "Yeah, why not? I'm sure he'd appreciate it. Besides, you've been talking about how you wanted to get to know the neighbors better." Rachel hesitated, feeling a strange knot in her stomach. "I don't know, it feels a bit forward." Mark smiled, nudging her gently. "Don't be shy. It's good to be friendly. I think it would be nice." Something about Mark's encouragement left her feeling unsettled, but she didn't want to overthink it. "All right, I'll go say hello." Rachel slipped out the back door, crossing the yard to where Daniel was now kneeling by a row of flowers. He looked up as she approached, wiping the sweat from his brow. Up close he was even more striking. His dark eyes held a quiet intensity, and there was a roughness to him that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "Hi, I'm Rachel," she said, trying to sound casual. "I live just next door." Daniel stood, brushing the dirt from his hands before extending one to her. "Daniel," he replied in a deep voice. His handshake was firm, his palm warm against hers. There was an awkward silence for a moment as they sized each other up. Rachel couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on her face, the intensity of his gaze making her stomach flutter. "Your garden looks great," she said, hoping to break the tension. Daniel smiled, a faint crease forming at the corner of his mouth. "Thanks, just trying to get everything settled." "Well, if you ever need help with anything, feel free to ask," Rachel offered, feeling a sudden rush of nerves as the words left her mouth. The offer felt too open, too personal, but she couldn't take it back now. Daniel's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing over his features before he nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." As Rachel turned to leave, she felt the weight of his eyes on her back, and the knot in her stomach tightened. She couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had shifted in that brief exchange, something that she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. When she returned to the house, Mark was waiting for her, a curious look on his face. "How'd it go?" Rachel shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "Fine. He seems nice." Mark's smile widened, and for a moment Rachel felt a strange sense of unease, as if there was something unsaid between them. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was nothing, but as the days passed she found herself thinking about Daniel more than she should. Each time she saw him in the yard, that same tightness in her chest returned. It wasn't long before Mark brought up the idea again. "Why don't we invite him over for dinner?" he suggested one evening, his tone light but with an edge that made Rachel's pulse quicken. "I don't know, Mark," she began, but he cut her off with a playful grin. "Come on, it'll be fun. Besides, I think it would be good to get to know him better. He seems like a decent guy." Rachel hesitated, something in the pit of her stomach warning her against it. But Mark was insistent, and she couldn't find a reason to refuse, so the next day they invited Daniel over. Dinner started innocently enough, but there was an undeniable tension in the air that only seemed to grow as the evening wore on. Rachel caught Daniel's gaze more than once, his eyes lingering just a second too long. Each time her heart raced a little faster, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between them, something dangerous. After dinner, as they moved to the living room for drinks, Mark leaned in close to Rachel, his breath warm against her ear. "What do you think of him?" he asked, his voice low and full of meaning. Rachel swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He's Interesting, she finally managed, her voice shaky. Mark's hand brushed her arm lightly, sending a shiver down her spine. I think so too. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Rachel's mind raced, trying to make sense of the sudden shift in Mark's demeanor, the strange look in his eyes. But before she could say anything, Daniel stood up, offering to help with the dishes. Rachel followed him into the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. As they worked side by side, the silence between them grew unbearable. Finally, Daniel broke it. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said quietly, his voice full of something unspoken. Rachel's hand froze on the dish she was holding. "Do what?" "Pretend," he replied, his gaze locking onto hers with a force that made her breath catch. Rachel's heart raced as Daniel's words hung in the air, heavy and charged with meaning. She wasn't sure how to respond, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening, of the strange connection that seemed to be growing between them. The kitchen felt too small, the distance between them too close, and she could feel the tension crackling in the air. "I'm not pretending," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. There was something unspoken here, something she didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't deny. Her hands trembled as she set the dish down, avoiding his gaze. Daniel moved closer, his presence overwhelming, the heat from his body radiating toward her. "Aren't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I've seen the way you look at me. It's not just curiosity." Rachel's breath hitched. She hadn't realized how transparent she had been, or how deeply he had been paying attention. "Daniel," she began, but her voice wavered. She couldn't deny it. There was something there, something magnetic that pulled her toward him, no matter how hard she tried to resist. He took another step closer, his proximity sending a wave of warmth through her. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with the earthiness of his earlier work in the garden. It was intoxicating, and she felt her pulse quicken, her body reacting to the nearness of him in ways she couldn't control. "I don't want to make things complicated," Rachel whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it was too late for that. Daniel's gaze was intense, his dark eyes searching hers for something, permission perhaps, or maybe just understanding. "Neither do I," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But sometimes things get complicated whether we want them to or not." Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, guilt, desire. She thought of Mark, of the life they had built together. But Mark had been the one to push her toward Daniel, to invite him into their lives. It didn't make sense, but the thought of her husband only deepened the mystery, adding another layer of tension to the already fraught situation. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against her arm, and the contact sent a jolt through her. It was barely a touch, but it was enough to make her heart race. She looked up at him, and for a moment they were both frozen, caught in the intensity of the moment. "I should go," she whispered, though she made no move to leave. Daniel didn't respond at first. Instead, his hand slid down her arm, his fingers grazing the sensitive skin of her wrist. The touch was electric, a spark that lit something deep within her that she had tried to ignore. She felt the pull between them, stronger now, undeniable. "You don't have to," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should walk away, step out of the kitchen and back into the safety of her marriage, her life. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed, her feet rooted to the spot, as if she were tethered to him by something invisible, something stronger than her will to resist. "I can't," she whispered, though her body betrayed her words, leaning imperceptibly closer to him. Daniel's eyes darkened with something that made her pulse quicken desire, yes, but also a quiet understanding. He didn't push her, didn't try to close the gap between them, but his presence was enough to make her feel as though the air around them was charged with electricity. They stood there, the unspoken words thick in the air between them, the tension mounting with every second that passed. Rachel's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, her skin tingling with the awareness of how close they were, how easy it would be to cross the line that hovered just out of reach. And then, in a moment of weakness, Rachel reached out, her fingers brushing against his chest. The touch was light, tentative, but it was enough to break the tension. Daniel's hand moved to cover hers, his touch warm and steady. He didn't pull her closer, but the weight of his hand on hers was enough to ground her, to make her realize just how far she had already come. I don't know what I'm doing, she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's gaze softened, and for the first time there was a hint of hesitation in his eyes. Neither do I, he admitted quietly. But the confession didn't make things easier. If anything, it only deepened the connection between them, making it harder to walk away. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. Rachel, a voice called from the other room, Mark's voice, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a knife. She jumped, pulling her hand back as if burned, her face flushing with guilt. Daniel stepped back, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his eyes that told her he understood the turmoil she was feeling. Rachel turned quickly, her heart still racing as she made her way back to the living room, trying to compose herself. Mark was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, completely oblivious to the storm that had just passed between his wife and their neighbor. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual. Rachel forced a smile, though her mind was still reeling from what had almost happened. "Yes," she replied, her voice strained. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't. Not really. Something had shifted tonight, something that couldn't be undone. And as Rachel sat down next to Mark, her heart still racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Rachel's mind was a tangled mess of emotions as she sat beside Mark, trying to act as if nothing had happened. She could feel Daniel's presence even though he was still in the kitchen, the memory of his touch lingering on her skin. Every glance Mark gave her made her heart race, guilt gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She felt trapped between two worlds, the safe, predictable life she shared with her husband and the dangerous, magnetic pull of her new neighbor. Mark seemed unaware of her internal struggle. He handed her a glass of wine and smiled warmly. "You seem tense. Everything okay?" Rachel took the glass, her hand trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, hoping the wine would help calm her nerves. Daniel entered the room just then, carrying a few empty plates. His gaze briefly met Rachel's before he turned to Mark. "Thanks again for dinner. I should probably get going." Mark's face fell slightly. "You sure? You're welcome to stay a bit longer." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Rachel, who quickly averted her gaze, feeling the tension spike again. "I appreciate it, but I've got some things to take care of. Maybe next time." Mark stood and shook his hand. "Of course. Any time, Daniel. It was good having you over." Rachel remained seated, gripping her glass as tightly as she could to steady herself. She didn't dare look at Daniel as he said his goodbyes and left the house. The moment the door clicked shut, she exhaled, her body slumping into the cushions, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Mark sat back down beside her, his arm draping over her shoulders. "You all right? You've been a bit quiet tonight." Rachel forced another smile, hating how easily the lies came. "Just tired, I guess." He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed in concern before he gave her a soft kiss on the cheek. "Maybe we can have Daniel over again sometime. Seems like a good guy." Her heart clenched at the mention of Daniel's name. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe." For days after, Rachel couldn't get Daniel out of her mind. His words echoed in her thoughts, and the memory of their brief but charged interactions haunted her. She tried to push it all away, focusing on her marriage, on Mark, on anything that would ground her in her life. But it was no use. The more she tried to suppress her feelings, the stronger they grew. It wasn't until a week later that she saw Daniel again. She had gone out for a walk in the early evening, hoping the fresh air would help clear her head. As she rounded the corner of her street, she saw him working in his yard again, shirtless this time, the muscles of his back flexing with each movement. The sight of him sent a shockwave through her, her breath catching in her throat. Before she could turn back, Daniel noticed her. He straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans, his eyes locking onto hers with that same intensity she remembered all too well. "Hey," he called out, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it, something unspoken that hung between them. Rachel hesitated, her mind screaming at her to walk away, but her legs seemed to have a mind of their own. She found herself walking toward him, her pulse quickening with every step. "Hi," she replied, her voice shaky. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of their last encounter pressing down on them both. Finally, Daniel broke the tension. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Rachel's heart skipped a beat, and she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. "Daniel." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know this is complicated," he said softly, "but I can't pretend that there's nothing here." Rachel looked down at the ground, her thoughts racing. "It's wrong," she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. What they were feeling wasn't black and white. It was messy, confusing, but it wasn't something she could easily dismiss. Daniel's hand reached out, gently brushing against her arm, sending a familiar shiver through her. "I don't want to cause any trouble, Rachel," he murmured, his voice full of sincerity, "but I can't ignore this anymore." Rachel closed her eyes, the internal conflict raging within her. She had spent days trying to convince herself that what she felt for Daniel was fleeting, that it would pass. But now, standing in front of him, feeling the warmth of his touch, she realized just how deeply she had been denying her own desires. When she opened her eyes, Daniel was closer than before, his face inches from hers. The world around them seemed to blur, leaving only the two of them in this bubble of intensity. She could feel his breath on her skin, the magnetism between them pulling her closer. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the admission. Daniel's hand moved to her cheek, his touch tender yet filled with the tension that had been building between them for so long. "You don't have to decide right now," he said softly. "Just don't walk away." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, her body betraying her as she leaned into his touch. The world around them faded into nothing, and for a moment all that existed was the space between them, shrinking with every second. And then, before she could stop herself, she closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a soft, hesitant kiss. It was brief, barely more than a whisper of a touch, but it was enough to send a shockwave through her, igniting something deep within. She pulled back quickly, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and desire. "I shouldn't have." But Daniel didn't let her finish. He pulled her back toward him, his lips crashing into hers with a fervor that made her knees weak. The kiss was full of all the tension, all the unspoken desires they had both been holding back, and it was overwhelming, consuming them both. Rachel melted into him, her body betraying every rational thought she had left. His hands roamed her back, pulling her closer, and she responded in kind, her fingers tangling in his hair as the kiss deepened. Time seemed to stand still as they clung to each other, their shared needs spilling over in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Rachel's mind was spinning, the weight of what they had done sinking in. "I can't do this," she whispered, though even as the words left her lips, she wasn't sure if she meant them. Daniel's gaze was intense, filled with longing and regret. "I know," he said softly, "but I don't think we can stop now." Rachel stood frozen, her body still tingling from Daniel's touch, her mind caught in the tumultuous aftermath of their kiss. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in shallow bursts as the weight of the situation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. "I should go," she said, her voice barely audible, though she made no move to leave. The truth was, she didn't want to go. Despite everything, despite the guilt gnawing at her insides and the voice in her head screaming that this was wrong, there was a part of her that didn't want to stop. A part of her that craved the intensity, the forbidden nature of it all. Daniel's gaze softened, his expression filled with both desire and regret. "Rachel," he stepped closer again, his hand reaching for hers, but she pulled back, the sudden reality of what they were doing crashing down on her. "I have to go," she said more firmly this time, her voice trembling with emotion. She turned and walked away, her legs feeling unsteady as she made her way down the sidewalk toward her house. Her mind was spinning, her body aching with the memory of his touch, but she forced herself to keep moving. When she stepped through the front door of her home, she was greeted by the familiar warmth and comfort of her life with Mark. But tonight it felt like a lie. Everything felt off kilter, as if her entire world had shifted, and she didn't know how to make it right again. Mark was in the living room, flipping through a magazine, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her. "Hey," he called out, glancing up with a smile. "How was your walk?" Rachel hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. It was fine, she lied, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. Mark didn't seem to notice. He patted the space next to him on the couch, motioning for her to join him. Come sit with me. Rachel stood there for a moment, torn between two worlds. She wanted to sink into the comfort of her life with Mark, to pretend that everything was okay, that nothing had changed. But something had changed. And as much as she wanted to deny it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something that would unravel everything. She sat down beside Mark, her body stiff and tense. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, and for a moment Rachel allowed herself to relax into the familiarity of his embrace. But the guilt was still there, gnawing at her, and no matter how hard she tried to push it down, it wouldn't go away. Days passed, and Rachel did everything she could to avoid Daniel. She busied herself with work, with house chores, with anything that would keep her mind occupied. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She couldn't forget the way his lips had felt against hers, the way his touch had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was as if a part of her had been awakened, a part she didn't even know existed, and now that it had, she couldn't put it back to sleep. One afternoon, as she was standing by the kitchen sink, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she knew before she even opened it who it would be. Daniel stood on the porch, his expression tense, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked conflicted, as if he didn't know whether he should be there or not, but something had driven him to come. I didn't mean to bother you, he said quietly, his eyes flicking toward the street, as if he were considering walking away. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. Daniel, this isn't a good idea, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I know, he said, stepping closer. But I can't help it. She could feel the pull again, the magnetic force that seemed to draw her to him no matter how much she tried to resist. She wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to his life and forget about her. But she couldn't. The truth was, she didn't want him to forget. Before she could stop herself, Rachel stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly behind her. She stood there in the fading light, the evening air thick with the tension between them. We can't keep doing this, she whispered, though her body betrayed her words, leaning toward him as if drawn by an invisible thread. Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. I don't want to stop, he said, his voice low and filled with something raw, something vulnerable. Rachel's heart ached with the weight of his words, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, she was kissing him again. This time it was different. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was full of all the longing and desire they had been holding back, and it consumed them both. They didn't stop. Not this time, they couldn't. Rachel wasn't sure how they ended up inside, how they found themselves in the privacy of her home, their bodies tangled together in a heated embrace. All she knew was that it felt right in that moment, that every touch, every kiss was something she had been craving for far too long. Time blurred around them, the world outside forgotten as they lost themselves in each other. It was intense, overwhelming, and when it was over, they lay together in the quiet, the weight of what they had done sinking in. Rachel stared at the ceiling, her body still humming with the aftershocks of their encounter, but her mind was racing. What had they just done? How had they crossed this line, and what would happen now? Daniel lay beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm, but the warmth that had been between them only moments ago was now tinged with the sharp sting of reality. We can't go back, Rachel whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. Daniel sighed, his breath warm against her skin. I know. They lay there in silence, the enormity of what they had done pressing down on them. Guilt, confusion, desire, it all swirled together, leaving them both raw and exposed. Rachel's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about Mark, about her marriage, about the life she had built, and the life she had just jeopardized. She didn't know how to make sense of it all, didn't know how to reconcile the part of her that had been drawn to Daniel with the part of her that still loved her husband. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed from the nightstand. It was a message from Mark, asking when she'd be home from running errands. Her heart sank, the guilt hitting her full force. I should go, she said, sitting up and reaching for her clothes, the weight of their actions pressing down on her like a physical burden. Daniel didn't try to stop her. He just watched as she dressed, his expression filled with the same turmoil she was feeling. I'm sorry, he whispered as she reached for the door. Rachel paused, her hand on the doorknob, and for a moment she almost turned back, almost let herself fall into his arms again. But she couldn't. Not now. Maybe not ever. She opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, her mind still spinning, her heart aching with the weight of everything that had just happened. As she walked down the street toward home, the guilt clung to her like a heavy shadow. She didn't know how she would face Mark, didn't know how she would explain the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside her. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same.